Hey, good morning. This is another episode of Deep Seven. This one came out of my morning reading today as I was studying through the book of Genesis just for my own personal time with the Lord. And I came across some things in the life of Joseph that really resonated with me. And I thought, um, I need to make a video about this today. And so, I think that the Lord pressed it upon my heart because possibly there's somebody watching this that needed to hear this message today. So maybe, you're struggling with something. Maybe you're in a place of suffering due to somebody else's failures or somebody else's sin or somebody else's wrongdoing. And you are crying out to God and asking, how long is this going to last? How long am I going to be in this place? And I think there's hope. I know there's hope for you. I know that there's purpose in what God's doing. We look at the life of Joseph, and sometimes when we look at these stories from the Old Testament, from Genesis, stuff we heard since we're little kids and the little Bible books and little Sunday school classes, we tend to read through them and not really pay attention. But there's so much richness in this. We find Joseph first in chapter 37 of Genesis, and he has a dream, and we read about it here in verse 6 and 7. He says, Joseph speaking, he said to them, hear this dream that I dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. This is one of two dreams he had. His family was not happy with his dreams. They felt like he was being a little high and lofty, maybe a little prideful, that they would, saying to them that they're going to bow down to him. This is something that God gave him at a very young age to hold him, to sustain him, to keep him um, mindful of the fact that God had bigger things for him because God knew what was coming. And we know the story. We know that he was out in the field with his brothers and they were jealous of him and they kind of hated him and they threw him in a pit. And then once they threw him in the pit, they sold him into slavery and he ends up in Egypt, and he ends up rising to a pretty prominent level in the house of a wealthy Egyptian. But then he's falsely accused of improprieties with the Egyptian's wife, and he ends up in prison. And then he goes to prison, and he's there, and he kind of rises to prominence in the prison. He's given privileges, he's given um, responsibilities there, and then he meets these two guys that worked for Pharaoh. And these two guys had dreams, and he interpreted the dreams for these two guys. And one of them was a favorable dream, and the guy was restored back to his job with the Pharaoh as the cupbearer, and the other guy got his head cut off and was hanged on a tree and eaten by the birds. Pretty gruesome story, but that's how life was back then. So then, after he interprets this dream for the cupbearer, he says this to him in verses 14 through 15 of, of chapter 40 in Genesis. He says, only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house, for I was indeed stolen from the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. So Joseph's letting him know, hey, I was falsely accused, I was treated poorly, and in all of this, Joseph has remained faithful to the Lord, which is the big key here. This is the big takeaway, that he was the victim of other people's crimes, other people's sin, and yet he still remained faithful to the Lord. And so here he is proclaiming his innocence, and he's telling this cupbearer, hey, I interpreted this dream for you. You're going to go back to work. You're going to get back in the presence of the Pharaoh. Don't forget me. But then we read this in the end of chapter 40, the last verse, verse 23 says, yet the cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So you can imagine Joseph. He's thinking, oh, this guy's going to go back to the Pharaoh. He's going to plead my case to him. The Pharaoh's going to be amenable to what this guy tells him because he's brought him back out of the jail and he's probably happy with him. He probably feels bad for him a little bit that he locked him up for no reason. So it's going to go well for me. And so what happens to Joseph? Nothing, because this guy completely forgot about him. And at this point, I imagine it would have, no one would have blamed him if he felt despondent. Nobody would have blamed him if he felt despair. Nobody would have blamed him if he would have sat there thinking, as Jesus rightfully cried out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? But we know that we have a promise of the Lord that he will never forsake us. He will never leave us. Joseph is sitting there in that prison. And then we find out in verse 1 of chapter 41, it says this: After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And then it goes on to talk about Pharaoh's dream. So for 2 years, after thinking he was going to get out, after thinking he was going to be released, he still sat there in that jail. And probably he was feeling very overwhelmed and possibly feeling forsaken by the Lord. But we know the rest of the story. We know that the Pharaoh has a dream, that he interprets the dream. It's about famine in the land, and Joseph interprets the dream for the Pharaoh and gets placed second in command of all of the land of Egypt. And he saves millions and millions of lives, including the lives of his own family who were back in Canaan, who were able to come and get food because of the famine. And what these people all conspired to do wrong to Joseph, where Satan possibly was involved in trying to do wrong to Joseph, God turned it around for good, even in the midst of Joseph's suffering. Now let's think back to what would have happened if, when the cupbearer went back to Pharaoh and told him about Joseph. Joseph maybe would have got out of prison. He probably wouldn't have been employable because he was a convicted felon. And maybe he would have just ended up some homeless guy running around begging for food, or possibly found his way back home to his family, where they would have just starved to death several years later due to the famine. But in Joseph's suffering, in Joseph's waiting on the perfect timing of God through the midst of his suffering, amazing things were done in him and through him. So if you're struggling today, if you're finding yourself in that place, I want to give you a verse that says, our present sufferings cannot compare to the glory we will receive in Christ Jesus. His suffering here seemed horrible at the time, but in retrospect, when he came out of it, when he came through it, I'm sure in his mind it was all worth it, because he even told his brothers, what you meant for evil, God used for good. So hang in there, trust in the Lord, dig into these scriptures, find hope for yourself, and know that the Lord will never leave you nor forsake you. Have a blessed day, and we'll see you next time.